Republican politicians are getting frustrated that their base is not buying into some of the BS economic arguments anymore, particularly on federal spending. In fact, according to a recent article in The Hill written by Scott Wong, Republicans are having a tough time generating outrage over Biden's multi-trillion-dollar spending agenda as they did over former President Obama's signature initiatives. So now one of them includes, of course, Obamacare. There's a lot of people that were really angry on the right over big spending programs like the ACA. But when they look at Biden's infrastructure plans, for example, which increased federal spending by quite a bit, far bigger than Obamacare, the ACA, they just shrug. Eh, eh, who cares? Eh. All right. Um, Kind of makes me wonder why the base is uh so kind of non-committal on that. Maybe the base has changed, or maybe had something to do with the president being named Barack Hussein Obama. Again, when you look at the ACA, and I'm speaking as somebody who's not a fan of the ACA, I'm a fan of expanding Medicare to everybody and enhancing Medicare. So adding like things like vision, dental, etc. The ACA was definitely not enough. It's a step in the right direction, sure. And you know, one of the criticisms from the left of the ACA is that it's essentially the Republican plan. That's what it was. It was the Mitt Romney care, but instead of just in Massachusetts, it was expanded to everywhere in the country. So, but ask the Republican politicians, and they'll say, "Oh no, the reason that fiscal conservatism isn't as popular anymore, is because it's not because it was ever really popular among conservatives. Yes, it's very popular among the rich, wealthy Republican donors, but never was really popular among the people. And so, nonetheless, they blame actually populism and Donald Trump. So now, Senate Republican Whip John Thune actually said this quote, "Unfortunately, fiscal concerns are probably not as important to the GOP base as 10 years ago, and that Trump helped transform the party's priorities. Quote, it wasn't something that was an important issue for President Trump, and so many of our base voters align themselves to President Trump. It's almost like now debts, deficits, and spending become abstract ideas that a lot of folks aren't paying attention to and should be." Interesting. Uh, I'm going to posit this. It's almost as if that didn't actually matter to Republican voters at all. I mean, it never really has. Let's be honest. They don't care. When somebody says, "Oh, I don't like big government," what's big government? It seems pretty nebulous of a concept. Like, what would you call big government? Well, Social Security? You ask most Republicans, they'll be like, "Oh, yeah, I'm cool with Social Security." Yeah. Oh, what about Medicare? Oh, yeah, I like Medicare. Again, if you ask people who are on Social Security and Medicare, they're going to say, "Well, yeah, I generally like Social Security, Medicare." That's not to say that there aren't problems with it. I would say that there's a lot of holes in Medicare that we could plug and we could add in and things like that. But generally, they're pretty happy with the spending on that stuff. And not only that, but U.S. Republicans, are you happy with military spending? They're going to say, "Yeah, well, yeah, oh yeah, I love spending $780 billion on the military every year. Fantastic, we love it." Again, it doesn't really matter. What they're actually mad about is some of that spending being towards the poor. That's the big problem in those people. You know what I mean. But anyway, here Thune continues. He says there was a political evolution, and the fiscal conservative was a core tenet of the Tea Party, got displaced by the more populist elements of the Republican Party. Actually, you know what? The Tea Party started out as raging against bank bailouts. I mean, that's what it started out as. That's what where the organic protests came from. And then what happened is that the donor class, they came in and they said, well, there's something that we can take over. That's something that we can exploit. And so from there on, they basically astroturf. They bust in people to suddenly be against Obamacare. And that's really where the Tea Party got its power. Because again, the people that were elected during the Tea Party surge ended up being in favor of corporations and giant bank bailouts and all that stuff. So, but no, they're saying, oh, populist. It's the populist wing of the party. Well, let me kind of point out what the populist wing of the Trump Republican Party is. Bashing immigrants, essentially, and espousing white nationalist talking points. That's what we see from the populist right, generally. And of course, that irritates the corporate donors who realize, oh, yeah, the corporate donors, and they basically say, well, shoot, we make money from black people and from gay people, and turns out they have money. They're a market. So we don't want you to go out and say these horrible things and pass these horrible laws because it makes us look bad, especially when somebody can look up open secrets and show that we have donated to these Republicans. Turns out being shitty to people does not appeal to a business. It's not good for a business to be shown as somebody who supports terrible legislation, hateful legislation. Now, Trump, by the way, did go after companies that were uncomfortable with his rhetoric. And so now, as a result, there's more of a strain in the Republican Party that thinks corporations have gone woke. When in reality, of course, they just don't want to openly fund hatred towards their own customers. They want to be Disneyfied. They want to be like, oh, we're cool, go buy our products. Make no mistake, though, companies aren't left-wing. They're also not really right-wing either. They're amoral. They want to be apolitical. They want to appeal to, in general, to as many people as possible. In order to meet people where they are, which is more culturally progressive, they're going to act more progressive. They're going to put out like, oh, look at us, we're so racial inclusive, et cetera, et cetera. When in reality, they still fund Republican politicians. And that's really what it is. Again, let me give you some examples, right? So, Nike hired Colin Kaepernick. Okay, good. But then Nike also gets caught using slave labor in Asia to make their shoes. Amazon, makes people pee in bottles with their insanely high production rates. But hey, but we pay people $15 an hour. Coke funds Republican politicians and takes $1 billion in subsidies. On and on and on. So you see what's going on here. They're not woke corporations. They're just marketing, and that's really what it is. And so, well, ironically, there's a lot of the Republican base that don't like these companies now that they're putting out those progressive cultural messages, but we're fine with all the other stuff that was happening. Oh, yeah, exploitation in Asia, totally fine. Other countries exploiting profit, billions of dollars left the government. And of course, there are some, conservatives that were like, oh, I don't like subsidies either. Oh, great. Agreed. I don't like subsidies either. But anyway, these companies still fiscally benefit from the Republican Party, mostly in the form of tax cuts and subsidies. And so that happens to drive debts and deficits more than anything, really. In fact, all the way from the Bush years and the giant Ronald Reagan tax cuts, those tax cuts have cost trillions of dollars. Bush, for example, added even more tax cuts onto it, and then 2 unfunded wars. And now, of course, as a result, the country has gigantic debts. We have crumbling infrastructure, all that stuff. Now, Democrats, by the way, I'm not letting Democrats go. Democrats also spend on corporations. They like corporate subsidies too. And like Republicans, they're also big spenders. Guess what? They also spend money on the military. Again, you had old Democrats that supported the Pentagon budget under Trump. And so, but here's the big difference is the Democrats, while they do all those other things that Republicans do, They occasionally try to raise taxes on the richest Americans, and they'll also throw a bone out to people who are poor, increase food stamp benefits, stimulus checks, things like that. And so, yeah, they will try to take care of the poorest, whereas Republican politicians are like, no, no, don't you dare put 1 cent towards the poor. All that money needs to go to the rich. All right. And so what John Thune is saying now in bringing this message and in this article itself is saying, stop spending money on poor people. We don't really care about infrastructure. No, we don't like the stimulus checks. We don't like the welfares. Get rid of it all. And we're really mad at our base right now for ignoring it, for forgetting about all that. And they tie it into worries about the national debt as they normally do. In fact, Thune said this: "I'm very frankly concerned about the level of spending and debt. They think Republicans have got to be the adults in the room and exercise fiscal responsibility that seems to have been absent, lacking the last several years." Again, they're trying to distance themselves from Donald Trump, despite the fact that Trump pretty much did everything that Republicans normally do when they get into office: spend more in the military, as well as cut taxes for the rich. So I don't know where this is coming from. Okay, it's pretty ridiculous. But you have more Republicans. Senator Lisa Murkowski, a so-called centrist, right, said the party is kind of different compared to the early years of the Obama administration. Quote, Tea Party fiscal conservatism is now hard to find, adding that the party base is more strongly conservative on social issues than anything else. And that's, of course, as a result of the culture wars. She also asked, who's the party of fiscal restraint anymore? I don't think either party has ever really been a party of fiscal restraint. It's generally been about the two Santas, where I don't know if any of you've heard about that, but basically the Republicans are the Santa Claus for the rich. They give rich tax cuts and deregulation and subsidies for corporations, and the Democrats are the Santa of giving, things to poor people, like affordable health care or more affordable health care, things like that. And so each party, tries to point at each other for being fiscally irresponsible, when in reality, they both have their priorities. And so for me, the problem is not we have a spending problem. No, the problem here is we have an allocation problem. Okay. And the allocation problem is we allocate too much money towards the rich and corporations and in tax cuts. We don't actually allocate enough money to things that actually help people. Okay. And that's the problem. Okay. And even when we do, corporate interests always seem to get in the way. They always need a piece of the pie. That's why our healthcare system sucks compared to everyone else. Why we pay, despite the fact that we pay twice as much for healthcare than they do in Europe, despite the fact that they actually have a more universal system. Okay. And the thing is that the insurance companies have to act as a middleman so they can extract profit from this. And so we can definitely save money by cutting the profit margin out of the equation. That's why I'm in favor of Medicare for all, for example. But there are things that we should do, that we need to do, that cost money. One of them is infrastructure. Republicans already put out an infrastructure plan that's about $500 billion, which barely touches anything, whereas the Biden administration wants to do a little bit more on infrastructure. And actually, that plan, compared to the Republican plan, which never seems to be popular, the Biden plan is actually much more popular, even with the Republicans. In fact, a Political Morning Consult poll from this month showed strong support among Republicans, Democrats, and independents for Biden's infrastructure spending priorities. 65% of voters were also on board with raising the corporate tax rate in order to help pay for those. The survey found that 42% of Republicans favored raising taxes on corporations. Stephen Smith, a professor of political science at Washington University in St. Louis, said the Republican warnings of 10 and 12 years ago that Obama's agenda would fuel inflation never panned out. As we could see, it didn't. Undercutting the potency of fiscal conservatism as a political message. They really don't care, though. Again, the Republican base never actually cared about fiscal conservatism. The thing is that they were so whipped up by the idea of some of their tax money going to so-called welfare queens, black people essentially, and poor. That's where they were outraged about. That's why they signed on to go against, any sort of spending on welfare programs, essentially. But then he said, quote, the Republican argument of 2009 that this massive increase in federal spending is going to cause disastrous inflation. It simply isn't an argument that holds water, most economists or the general public. We've never experienced much inflation, still aren't experiencing much inflation, and yet have another economic downturn with massive unemployment and underemployment. I think the public buys the argument the government has an essential role in recovery. Again, if you actually talk about some of these issues without invoking party, some of these ideas, without saying, oh, AOC's for this, or, this Republican politician's for that, generally most people will agree that government has a bigger role to play and wants government to have a bigger role in, for example, taking care of people. It's when you start naming people, Bernie Sanders says this, AOC says that, Biden says this, that's where you get that political partisanship in the way of actually doing real solutions. And again, the reason that I think most Republicans hated the ACA and hated other things like that is not because it was missing some serious things, right? Like a Medicaid expansion or public option even, which would have been ripe at the time, which then we might actually be talking about a Medicare for all seriously. They would have a serious discussion. But no, we didn't even get any of that. And a lot of it came from the right wing, just hating a black man. So, I mean, that's what we're doing here, okay? It's never been about fiscal responsibility when it comes to Republicans and their voters. It's always been about owning the libs and hating the black guy. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.